Hello everyone, this is a video about William Blake's poem The Garden of Love, which features in his collection of poems known as the Songs of Innocence and Experience. This video is aimed at A-level English literature students who are studying Blake as part of their qualification. And this video is designed to be quite short, giving you the key concepts. So this poem in itself comes from the Book of Experience, which was published after the Book of Innocence, which was then put together to form one collection of poems. To give you the summary then of the poem, a chapel has been built in a field where children, including the speaker, once used to play. So where flowers once grew, there are now graves and gravestones, and despite this church being newly built, it is locked and has above the door part of the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not. So that is the literal meaning. It's about a poem that has been built on a once kind of playing field. But this poem is slightly more ambiguous because it also has the metaphorical meaning, which is what this chapel represents and what the land that it was built on represents. So in this poem, Blake uses the chapel and the poem to attack the restrictive and dogmatic approach to organised religion, accusing the church of eradicating love, joy, and freedom, as well as sexual freedom, in favour of rules and regulations. And Blake believed this impacted negatively on the romantic and personal spirit of individuals. So Blake saw the church as oppressive because it made innocent desires sinful. But there is also the separate criticism of the church, is that rather than helping the poor, it actually colluded with the state and the wealthy to keep the poor in poverty and to perpetuate their sense of suffering. So whereas literally this poem is about the building of a chapel on a piece of land, on a metaphorical level, it also represents Blake's disguised attack of organised religion and the church as an institution. So this is the poem. It's a relatively short poem. It's only, 3 stanzas. And of course, Blake isn't well known really for writing long poems. A lot of the poems in the collection are short. And you can perhaps guess that this poem would come from the collection of Experience because of the imagery and because of the sense of regret or the sense of melancholy in the narrative voice, in the speaker's voice. So if we look at the first stanza, we can see that you could argue that it's an ironic title, The Garden of Love, because Blake is actually using the poem to attack and rebel against religious thinking, which he regarded as repressive, rather than actually writing a poem about a biblical paradise such as Eden. So perhaps you could argue that the title of this poem is quite ironic. You could also argue that Blake is equating the fall of man with organised religion, and therefore instead of sin. So rather than people falling because of their sins, they're falling because of the repressive nature of the church. We have a homodiegetic viewpoint because the speaker is referring to himself, and it's believed that it's an adult speaker who has come across the land where he used to play as a child, noticed the churches there, and it makes him think about what he cannot do anymore, which is play on the land as well as other children can't either. So the chapel is capitalised, which perhaps suggests that the chapel has an imposing presence on this piece of land, and the speaker has that dismayed tone. It's also written in the past tense where I used to play, so he can no longer play there if he wanted to, because the chapel is in the way, and of course gravestones and graves have been used to fill the plot of land. So this chapel and its associated graves around the outside in the churchyard is representative of the invasion of rules and regulations onto the freedom and love that individuals are supposed to feel or have a right to feel. So here, nature is seen as suffering as a victim because of man's decisions in building this chapel. As we move into the second stanza, the speaker says that when he approaches that chapel, the doors of the chapel are shut and they are locked. And you could say that that's a metaphor for the restrictive and loveless imposition of religion onto people's lives that actually quashes freedom, love and pleasure. In other words, what's the use of a chapel if it's shut? And also, who has the key? Because that chapel is inaccessible, and perhaps Blake is attacking the elitism of the church because it separates itself from its people. So the question is, who is locking it? Who has the key? Because the belief is, of course, that those who have the key have the most power, and it's not the people in poverty who might need the charitable help of the church. The speaker also notices above the door that the imperative "thou shalt not" is written there, which is obviously reference to the Ten Commandments, which emphasizes rules and regulations. So it's a negative imperative. It's intimidating, unwelcoming, even before you get in the church. It's forbidding rather than permitting. We're also told in that stanza that there used to be flowers that grew in the churchyard, and obviously flowers are natural pastoral imagery. But unlike a poem that might be in the Book of Innocence, for example, here the flowers are no longer growing, and therefore the flowers which are symbolic of love and freedom are in effect no longer around. So that freedom and love is no longer around either. And as we go into the third stanza, we can see that those flowers now have been replaced with graves. So the natural beauty of flowers has been replaced with the graves, alluding to the burial of pleasure and love, so natural desires. So rather than flowers growing in the land, there's now graves, which obviously also has symbolism of death and decay. There are also tombstones, symbolic of death and a sense of an ending, and this conflicts with the innocence of children at play. It goes against the freedom and the enjoyment and the merriment that we might see with some innocence poems where children are free to play, such as in The Echoing Green. And the final image that we have in this poem is of priests who are in black gowns, who are walking their rounds. And we have here the idea that they are perhaps some kind of morality or religious police, policing behaviour as if they're patrolling the churchyard. So there's a sense of surveillance here, this repressive sense of organised religion. And binding with briars my joys and desires. So in both of these lines we have some internal rhyme, gowns and rounds, briars and desires. And this emphasises perhaps the restrictive power or punishment of the church, and that oppression. And it's the quashing again of that romantic spirit with some added surveillance. So in this poem, yes, it is a poem about a church, a locked church, being built on a place that used to be where children used to play. But it's also more ambiguous in the sense that it's about the repressive and oppressive nature of the church and the impact that can have on freedom and love and pleasure and joy. Okay, so that is the Garden of Love.